Hello and good evening and welcome to episode 92 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks to everyone who's joining us live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and also on TikTok now. So TikTok. So thank you for joining us. It's just myself this evening interviewing our wonderful guest, Nancy Fraser, who I'm going to invite on stage now. Hello, Nancy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, William. It's a pleasure.
With your second name, Nancy, do you have any Scottish connections?
No, it's a name that I acquired by marriage, unfortunately, so no.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. You're currently the Henry and Louise A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. You work on social and political theory, feminist theory, and we've also got contemporary French and German thought. Now, what we're going to discuss this evening is this wonderful book, and it was one of our top 5 economic books of the year, Cannibal Capitalism. When I picked it up, Nancy, I'm sure similar people have been in a similar situation. It's a very short book, and I described it as almost kind of manifesto-like. And I picked it up and I thought this will take me a few hours, maybe a day to read. But honestly, after every second or third page, I had to put it down, make a note, think about it. So it took me an absolute age for me to get through it. There was so much in it. I just wondered, firstly, very briefly, what made you write this book? And then I want to ask you about 2 kind of core fundamental things that I think underpin the book.
Well, I was moved to write the book because I feel that we're living in a time of a very acute crisis. I think it is a crisis of capitalism, but it is not simply an economic crisis, although it has economic aspects. It's at the same time an ecological crisis, a political crisis, a social crisis. And I felt that the theories of crisis that we have available to clarify this kind of crisis, a general crisis of the whole social order, multidimensional, those theories are not adequate. I wanted to sort of keep the focus on capitalism, but understand capitalism in a broader way that would allow us to theorize the crisis in its full dimensions, in all of its multiple dimensions. So that was the agenda in the book.
Well, I certainly think you did that because I've looked at the crisis that we're in completely differently. And I'm sure that was the objective for a reader like me to kind of take that step back and say, well, capitalism isn't just about the economy. And that's the first place I'd like to start, because that's the first thing I picked up was this: capitalism is something larger than the economy. And this, I think, when you think about it, seems really obvious, but we never approach capitalism in that way. So could you give us a bit more an explanation of how and why capitalism is much bigger than just this economic structure?
Yeah, I think of capitalism, and the term I use in the book is as an institutionalized social order. And to me, the crucial thing is not only the internal workings of the economic subsystem in that order, but also the relations between the economic subsystem and the rest of society, the relation between the economy and its background conditions of possibility. Now, that's a Kantian phrase, background conditions of possibility. It may sound philosophically technical, but the idea is simple. It's just that you don't get production without workers, and those workers have to be birthed, cared for, sustained, nurtured, fed, bathed, clothed, etc., somewhere by somebody. You don't get production without, quote unquote, raw materials and energy from nature. And that is, strictly speaking, not inside the economy, but a background condition for the possibility of an economy. You don't get production, exchange, profit-making, capital accumulation without public powers, governing capacities that can maintain money supplies, legal systems, crisis management, regulation, et cetera, public goods that the market can't produce. In other words, the economy is part of something much bigger. It can't happen, it can't function without all of these background conditions. And I think the thing that is peculiar about capitalism as an institutionalized social order is that it licenses actors and processes within the economy proper to, in effect, help themselves to feed off of these background conditions. So for me, the crucial thing is, what is the relation between the capitalist economy and the other quote unquote non-economic aspects of the social order that it relies on and tends, as my title suggests, to cannibalize.
Yeah, fantastic. And certainly, with a kind of ecological perspective, we're looking at the economy embedded within the ecosphere. And a kind of neoclassical view of the economy is this kind of separate, this perpetually growing, somehow manages to deal with all the waste and receive all the models and all the resources from within that model. So this is a very different kind of pre-analytical view of our economy, very different from the neoclassical framework. I've got a little quote here from the book, which says, we often overlook a crucial feature of this social system, which is capitalism, and this is capital's drive to cannibalize wealth in zones beyond the economic. And I thought that was really, really powerful. The second area that really grabbed me was this idea of moving from a commodity production to social reproduction. And I know this is one of the fundamental aspects of feminist economics. I'd love you to go into that in a little bit more detail. What do we mean? Because our economy focuses on commodities. How can we move or understand the economy differently when we look through this lens of social reproduction?
Right. As I sort of said a few minutes ago, you can't produce commodities without some kind of a background of things that are not commodities. I once wrote an essay that was about Karl Polanyi called Why Society Cannot Be Commodities All the Way Down. In other words, let's just, for the social reproduction aspect of this is what is informally called care work, right? The activities of caring for people who are going to be the economic actors, the producers, the workers, the salespeople, and ultimately the consumers who buy the stuff. So all of those people have to be sustained, and that work is historically associated with women. Capitalism splits the production of things and of profit from the production of people, if we use this word for production for everything. In other societies, non-capitalist societies, these activities have been much more integrated, part of the same social universe, and all have been recognized as socially important and valuable in some sense or another. With capitalism, with the differentiation of a separate economic system that is monetized, that runs by contract and exchange and by exploitation, as Marx famously taught us, that casts everything else into the shadows. And suddenly the work of care becomes less visible, less valued, and more gendered, actually, than it used to be. Now, it's also true that some care work becomes commodified. When you get into, and some of it takes the form of public goods, which is another form of non-commodity, right? When states get into the business of trying to bolster social reproduction, which is being eaten away by the profit-seeking economic system of the society, states get into the act. They start to provide public services so that not all of care work is done in private homes. A lot of it is done in state institutions, in schools, in hospitals, in care homes, and the like. And in the time we're living in, as many states are divesting and cutting those public services, more and more care work is being commodified. So we now have private care homes that are run for profit and are probably not very good places to be if you're sick and old and so on. With private hospitals, private schools for the wealthy, and so on. So, there is definitely commodification of this sector, but when that happens, there are always remainders of care work that are outside the circuits of monetized exchange in general. So, what we need to understand is a system in which commodities coexist with public goods and with what we could call free gifts. And that's a kind of ironic term, right? Free gifts of nature, things you don't have to pay for, free gifts of love and care in the home. So contrary to the idea that capitalism is a system in which the sort of everything is commodity, it's really about the relation between the commodity, the public goods, and the free gifts. And it's a perverse and problematic relationship. It's not a smooth, easygoing relationship. It involves exactly this kind of cannibalization.
That's such an interesting perspective. I've just watched a video from an ecological economist, and they were saying something very similar about the natural world and the cannibalism of it. And he was kind of taking an anthropological perspective as well, just saying that it's only capitalism that only values something because it has a monetary value. And as you said, all other forms of managing a society gave equal weight to the to other jobs, other functions, not just ones that had a monetary value. And I thought that was really, really interesting. So for me, those were the two big things that jumped out at me. And please do any questions for Nancy as we go through. That would be great. But I just wanted to kind of get into some of the more detail that's in the book around these areas, because we've briefly covered the kind of care and the natural world, but going through in order that you've done in the book, the first thing you said about capitalism was that it was structurally racist. And I'd like to start there. And could you give our viewers and our listeners just an overview of how you were able to say that very confidently and evidenced within the book?
Yeah. Well, I was very influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois and other thinkers in the Black Marxist tradition who have posited the fundamental character of a global color line, as well as, domestic, like U.S. Jim Crow order or slavery or whatever, a global color line. And it occurred to me that it was a mistake to think that profit and capital accumulation came exclusively or even primarily from the exploitation of wage labor, as Marxists have always thought. And I'm not at all contesting the idea that free wage labor is exploited. It's not paid for the surplus value it creates, but only for the necessary living costs of the worker and so on. Fair enough. But there's an additional major source of profit in a capitalist society, and that is unfree labor that is not exploited but expropriated and simply seized, put to work under the lash, or locked in sweatshops or in brothels or in prisons and so on, all the places where even to this day unfree labor or semi or dependent labor it is expropriated. These are cases where the worker doesn't go through the labor market, doesn't receive a monetary wage, isn't free to leave after the workday ends, and so on and so forth. So it's not the same as exploitation, but it historically, these two, I call them the two X's in the book, exploitation and expropriation. The two X's are entwined, and the capitalist economy doesn't work without the two together. They're like two pistons of a single engine, if you like. So just think about the much discussed early industrial textile mills in Manchester and presumably in Scotland as well. Where does the cotton come from? The plantation. The fate of the free workers and the enslaved workers, they're both part of one system. These are not two systems. And as I say, I don't think expropriated labor has disappeared. I think it continues in a whole variety of guises, and it's very, very cheap. So there's a strong interest on the part of profit seekers, right, to have resort to unfree labor in various contexts. And the sort of the distinction between exploitation and expropriation is the color line. That's how I understand it. It's a racial distinction that it corresponds very roughly to this division, both historically and in the present. So I say that the expropriation of unfree labor is a condition for the possibility, there's that language again, a condition for the possibility of the profitable exploitation of free labor. And this is an idea that is not wholly unique to me. I mean, I've added the racial dimension, but you can find arguments to this effect in thinkers like Rosa Luxemburg, or who says imperialism is essential to capitalism for similar reasons. David Harvey distinguishes between accumulation through commodity production and accumulation through dispossession. These are all cognate, close, analogs to what I'm arguing here. And the thing about it, expropriation, is that it's an economic condition, unwaged, unmarketized, but it's also a status distinction. You don't have access to state protection, to actionable rights. You can't draw a line and say, you can do this to me, but not that. You're like open to violation. And in my view, that condition of being open to violation is the deepest meaning of racial oppression, exposure. I'm not trying to say that the condition of free exploited wage earners in factories is idyllic by any means, but it does carry with it at least the theory of being able to invoke protections and draw lines, have access to courts and to police protection and so on. And that is not the case for people of color in many places throughout the world.
Yeah, and I thought that was drawn out really well in the book, the historical aspect to that as well. And I know we had a guest on the show a good few months ago now who said that, in the UK, the working class wasn't taxed, but the working class in the empire was taxed. And those revenues or resources at the time were brought over to the UK to allow this kind of system to be able to operate, because without that extra resource from the empire, but also this kind of monetary value, capitalism couldn't work. So without that extractive element, it just wasn't sustainable enough. And
That's
that
right.
For me is what it seems to be in the book. You've just said capitalism is always just eating itself. That's the kind of premise of the book, isn't it? It's just always kind of looking at everything around it and eating it and spewing it out just to continue.
Yeah, the system incentivizes owners, investors. It's built into the set of incentives that they have. Their incentive is to get the cheapest inputs that they can, and if that means, doing forms of mining that create terrific mercury poisoning and or greenhouse gas emissions, then fine. And if they can avoid taking any responsibility for that, fine. That their incentives are basically to free ride and not take responsibility for repairing and replacing what they use up. The ecological is a good example of that, but they also do that with respect to the wealth and health of subjugated, dependent peoples in the periphery, in colonies and in post-colonies, including through the kind of wealth drain that you just mentioned. It's not, expropriation is not only about unfree labor, but it's about stealing land and dumping toxic waste and humongous drain of debt service, in indebtedness, and so on. The incentives are so perverse, and they do the same thing with respect to care. Just help yourself. Don't worry about where the people who provide it are coming from, and whether they can reproduce themselves. Just take. And with states too, the behavior of firms in relation to states is all about figuring out how to offshore, how to avoid taxes, how to game the regulations, how to implant their own people as lobbyists and regulators and so on. So they want to have it both ways. They want the kinds of regulations that make their profit seeking possible, but at the same time, it's another form of free riding. It's you're using and destroying it at the same time.
Yeah, with the example that I really enjoyed in the book, and it's one of those interesting things. I'd never heard about it before, and then I heard it 2 or 3 times from different sources in the same week. And this was this story of guano, and how this was used to basically fertilize land across Western Europe. Do you want to just tell us tell us that little bit of the story?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to give the credit for the research on this to John Bellamy Foster and his colleagues who have written about this. It's not me. I've basically taken their account of it. It's an example of what they call the metabolic rift that capitalism introduces, a rift between town and country, economy and nature. And basically what you had with intensive profit-driven agriculture in Europe was a soil depletion crisis. And basically the nutrients that are taken out of the soil are not returned to it with that town-country split. All the food is sent to the big cities to feed the workforce there. And the waste is not returned to the countryside, to the land, but dumped into rivers, and so people are living in open sewers and so on in the 19th century. So you get a fertility crisis in the soil and the need for fertilizers. And this is before the invention of chemical fertilizers. The idea was guano or bird shit, basically, is what they use. And so Bellamy Foster and his colleagues tell the story of these cliffs in the Pacific Ocean off of Peru that are just caked with centuries of bird shit. These are sort of roosting places where birds migrate to all over the world. And they get Chinese contract workers, coolies, who are very close to being slaves, not literally, but close. And they bring them over there. The death rate among these people who are sort of on top of these cliffs over the ocean trying to scrape the stuff off is horrific. So there's another part of the global color line, the use of peripheral peoples and peripheral resources confiscated to solve a problem in Europe created by capitalization of agriculture, essentially. And once they deplete those supplies, then they go and invent the chemical fertilizer, which has its own very serious negative ecological effects with poisoning groundwaters and so on and so forth. So it's each time one problem is created, the fix ends up just displacing the problem elsewhere.
Yeah,
That's
well,
part of this cannibalization dynamic.
absolutely, and that's certainly one of the criticisms of capitalism, is that and technology and the role within that is it never solves the next problem. It creates the next problem. It just solves a problem at the moment. I really like that story, because what we often hear about wealth, and the reason why Europe is so wealthy, is that we had all this kind of ingenious white middle-aged men who were able to fashion all these wonderful products with the genius from their head. And I remember someone saying, well, actually, they had the time to do that because of all of the time that was spent in other parts of the world providing the cotton for the cotton mills, the sugar for the tea to keep the industrial workforce, the guano for the fertilizers. And we forget that all these people, rather than inventing things and kind of, transforming the wealth in their own country, were doing that to allow us to transform wealth. So I think there was a huge historical element of the stories that you told in here that really resonated for me. We've kind of alluded to it, and so maybe we won't spend too much time on it. But the next chapter you've got is Nature in the Maw. And that's a similar story. And for me, with an ecological economics background, this is one that, instantly my kind of ears pricked up on. Could you just go again, just to explain how and why capitalism just treats nature as something to use and abuse?
Well, I think I really can repeat what I just said. The incentive structure is, it encourages people to take stuff as cheaply as they can. It absolves them of any responsibility for repair and replenishment. And it by dividing the world into a sort of a core zone and a peripheral zone, it creates a kind of it essentially treats whole continents, whole regions as just dumping grounds. So I think that the field of environmental or ecological economics is extremely exciting. I'm learning a lot from reading people. I'm not a specialist in it, but I'm very struck by concepts like environmental load displacement. That's a great idea. That, going back to what you said about the wonders of industrialization in England and in the capitalist core, basically they just offload the environmental stresses onto the suppliers of all that labor and land and natural resources that they're scarfing up from elsewhere. So it shows me that you have to look behind the official economy to these background conditions, to these relations, that there's a larger context, a larger social system in which these rather perverse cannibalizing relations are situated. And the whole idea of thinking that you can understand something called an economy by looking inside only at the monetized sphere seems to me to be very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you discover that the idea of the economy is less than 100 years old. It kind of only really came to kind of popular discourse in the 40s. And this aligned with obviously the measurements of GDP, just looking at value and excluding all the areas we spoke about. An interesting takeaway that I took from the book was this idea of from an ecological perspective, of the transformation of wealth. And it's not, the wealth hasn't been created in Europe. It was transformed from the natural capital that we had in Europe and much further afield. So again, I think that is missing from our discord around wealth. This idea that we have financial wealth now because we're using up our natural wealth. And again, that just sees capitalism as this kind of ultimate cannibal within that process. We've got a couple of comments and questions, if I could drop them in now. I'll go, here's one for you, which might raise a chuckle for you. Does Nancy think that China is a successful example of Marxism-Leninism?
In a short answer, absolutely not. China is a very interesting and complicated example of something, but it's certainly not exactly Marxism-Leninism. I would say that today, China is a kind of dirigiste economy with a very significant state sector, including control over banking and some very key elements of its economy, but it also has a significant private sector, a lot of foreign direct investment, and so on. So it's some kind of a new hybrid, and it's not strictly a command economy on the model that the Soviet Union once was, and so on.
And certainly, if we were to look at China through the kind of framework that you have here, you can see the kind of deep-seated racism within China. You can also see the huge issues around natural resource use, and certainly the area we're going to touch on next, which is democracy. So in many ways, the economy in China is a capitalist economy in the kind of cannibalistic nature that you described in the book. Well, that's certainly my perspective of that. I've got a comment here which I think you'll enjoy. We're a little bit scatological tonight. Here's another one about an argument in a toilet. I'll never forget an argument with some obscure Tory MP, and I'll never forget the following statement he made: "You, the working class, are necessary parasites, and as soon we will replace you with technology." Go on, James. Even if you want to just DM me, you can tell me when that was. I wonder if I was in Parliament at the time and who that was. But certainly, joking aside, Nancy, within the book you're talking about this role of the working class in Europe, but also incredibly supported, this whole capitalism supported by those in the periphery, and I think the book covers that wonderfully. I'd like to move on now to this idea of democracy, and this was the area I think I was most surprised reading. I've actually finished one of your colleagues' books, Austerity, The Capital Order, and that covers that in great detail. But it was wonderful to read it in kind of a shorter section in here. But could you explain that, why capitalism seems to only be able to survive by destroying democracy?
Well, as I said before, the economy needs public power, but it is also, its actors are incentivized to cannibalize the public power, to use some of it when it works for them, but to avoid taxes and regulations and so on and so forth. So the relationship between economy and polity is contradictory, just like the relationship between economy and care is contradictory. It's something that the economy needs, but is also primed to destroy or to deplete or to destabilize, we can say. So right away, you've got a contradiction. I call it the political contradiction of capitalism, as opposed to the Marxian idea of the economic contradictions of capitalism. And what I try to do historically in that chapter is to walk through some principal phases in capitalism's history, phases of its development, from mercantile capitalism to liberal colonial capitalism, to social democratic capitalism, and now to neoliberal capitalism, and to try to show how this contradiction, this tension between economy and polity, two aspects of the social order, is expressed differently in each time. And I would say that the political contradiction takes two forms. It can take the form of a crisis of governance, where economic actors are so successful in evading and weakening public power that the system doesn't have the public power it actually needs, right, to keep itself going. I think that we're sort of in that point now, at least in the United States, where what the government can do is being clawed back by the Supreme Court, for example, so that we actually don't really have the ability to solve a lot of the problems that the system is generating. The system generates serious problems, and it also weakens the capacity to solve the problems. That's the governance crisis side of it. But there's also the crisis of hegemony. I'm using this Gramscian term for the ability of the system to win sufficient support, sufficient, if you like, buy-in, to use an economic metaphor, or legitimacy among the people subject to it, to be able to, say that it is in some sense or another democratically, consented to. And I think we've got a crisis of hegemony now, as well as a crisis of governance, where lots of people don't actually believe in democracy, and are looking for strong men, for, fascist or neo-fascist or authoritarian movements of one kind or another. This is a very severe problem right now in the United States, as I'm sure you know, as we're gearing up for the 2024 election. And the same kind of thing is going on in many places and many countries and regions throughout the world. So democracy, I mean, you first of all have the problem that much of democratic action, the field in which democratic action can take place, is very narrowed in capitalism, precisely because of this separation between voting and buying, between governing and exchanging. So in other words, the political and the economic are split, and it's always a site of struggle. How far can the government go? How far will the market actors push back? But one thing I try to do in the book is to show how these contradictions in capitalism generate fault lines, places where there's constant struggle. Where is the line between state power and market power? Anyway, that's already a way of curtailing democracy, because so much of, we don't have, let me go back to the ecological for a moment. We don't have in our society the ability to vote and decide and implement decisions about what the energetic basis of our economy should be. That is left in the hands of the markets, of the stock market, of the financial markets, of the corporate balance sheets, and so on. Those guys decide. We don't decide. That's just one example. We don't decide what should be produced, how, where, et cetera, et cetera. This is all offloaded onto the markets, and they do a terrible job.
They do a terrible job, and there's a false premise that every 4 years we're able to change the direction of society and the economy, and this is in the UK you're choosing between two slightly different colors of blue at the moment. And the idea in a first past the post system that they have in the UK, and also obviously in the States, the idea that there is a real option for change is just nonsense. It is and always has been the elite who decide on what's produced and all of the other resources that are used. And I wanted to pick up just that. We still, as you won't be surprised to hear, in Scotland, with our party in government, the SNP, who are fairly neoliberal. I think I'm being generous there. I think they're fairly neoliberal. But recently I read an article by one of the major or the best known MPs in London, and he was talking about the power of capitalism and where would we be without capitalism. And it's so supportive of everything that we believe in. And I know Carol Polanyi had just said, actually, the history of capitalism is continual struggle with the politics through democracy and through government. This is the story of capitalism. It's not this idea of it being wonderful and everyone jumping on board and it's solving all of the problem. Before I move on to a couple of questions, why do you think we've ended up with a narrative around capitalism that is just so detached from the actual history of capitalism, going, you know, right back to the early 1800s?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, there are people who have a strong interest in creating such a narrative and in disseminating it and so on. And then there's the difficulty of counter narratives. Counter narratives do exist, but they tend to be more marginalized, sort of shut out of the principal, you know, opinion fora. They're not sort of debated on equal terms and so on. I think this is part of a general problem of ideology and hegemony, that and it's not just, the narrative isn't only that capitalism is great. It's Thatcher's Tina. There is no alternative. Look at how terrible the Soviet Union was, and so on and so forth. Look at how imperialist and undemocratic and authoritarian China is, and so on and so forth. And it's true that attempts to develop alternative social systems at the level of really existing societies have not gone well. But that doesn't mean that we're not really up against the wall and don't need to try to figure out how to do it right. Because if we stay on this path, we're facing, in a relatively short time, planetary breakdown on a massive scale, as well as all these authoritarian dangers and militarism, war, and so on. So we can't know for sure. I don't feel I can know for sure exactly what the alternative looks like, but I know that if we don't try to figure that out and bring it about, we are sunk.
Yeah. Absolutely, I think that's a wonderful point. Well, we've got another couple of questions which I think lead us into the, okay, we've got all these problems, Nancy, what are we going to do about it? So I'll go for the first question here from one of our regular viewers, Hashbury, said, would the wide-ranging socialist movement described by Nancy include social democrats, as these are the majority of our elected representatives in Scotland?
Well, here's now where we're transitioning now to the sort of a question of political strategy and program and organization and so on. This is a different level. The book is mainly written as elaborating the theoretical basis of a critique. But let me just say that one thing the critique shows is that the root cause of many severe problems which appear to be discrete and not connected to one another, that they share a single root cause in this cannibalizing DNA of a capitalist society. And that suggests the importance of building some kind of a counter-hegemonic bloc, some kind of a very broad alliance that would foster coordination, cooperation, if not some sort of a single party that I'm agnostic about, but cooperation, coordination among people who are now engaged in struggles against serious crisis aspects, and struggles that are potentially emancipatory. And by that, I mean struggles against police violence throughout the world, ecological struggles over care and over precarity, livelihood security, democracy. All of these things are serious and need to be organized around, and in a way that leads to deep structural societal change. And all of that, and part of that change, it's not the whole story, is disabling this cannibalization dynamic that is built into capitalism.
Yeah.
So I'm for that kind of a thing. And as far as I'm concerned, in terms of social democrats, I personally, as a theorist, I believe these struggles should be anti-capitalist. But as a political actor, I'm not sectarian. Anybody, you can be a social democrat. You can believe that we can fix it within capitalism. That's fine, as long as you are for defossilizing the whole world economy and for eliminating militarism, imperialism, racism, sexism. As long as you're for, we'll see if it can be fixed within capitalism or not. Let's not worry what we call the end result.
Yeah.
Or what exactly it looks at. Let's just build the kind of
position what we have at the moment. Yeah. We can certainly be too tribal, and I think Scotland is as guilty as any other nation, no more so, no less so, of being very tribalistic when it comes to who is involved, who's not involved, who has the position and the rights to move forward. I think that you're kind of alluding to this an idea that sits outside of neoclassical economics and system dynamics, and looking at all of the crises and the problems through this multifaceted, multidimensional lens, and seeing all the connections and the positive and the negative feedback loops. Do you think that neoclassical economics is perhaps the worst designed lens imaginable to look at the problems we face today? That's a very leading question, Nancy. I'll say that.
I can think of some other very bad ones too. I don't know about the worst. You have to understand, I have spent the last 20 years of my life teaching at the New School, where our economics department mercifully is not neoclassical. So I don't rub shoulders with these people to the extent that you do.
Great. And we've got such a smart audience. I've got one question for you here from Charles Smith, another regular viewer. So I'll bring this up on screen. I'll read it out. Who would be the arbiter of acceptable or unacceptable industrial innovation or developments? For me, this is talking about who decides a social surplus. I'm not sure if you've got the same reading of that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I presume that the question applies in a hypothetical good socialist society. How would these decisions be made? And again, my book is primarily critique and the theoretical foundation for critique, but there is a last chapter that tries to at least lay out some principles for thinking about what a socialist society might be today. And I freely admit that this is quite exploratory, and, it's just the beginning. And but one thing I do say is no markets at the bottom and no markets at the top. Space for the possibility of markets in between. In other words, I'm not against markets, but against the role that markets play in a capitalist society, which is that role of allocating all the major factors and inputs of production and allocating the use of the collective fund of our energies and our wealth. Which you guess we can call the social surplus. So no markets at the bottom means, basic necessities, housing, healthcare, and so on should not be commodities, but public goods. No markets at the top means that the allocation of surplus cannot be left to the owners, to the large market actors, to the big investors, and so on. People can, there might be private enterprises, but not at a scale that they can actually dictate the allocation of these major forms of collective wealth that come from all of us. And so we have to devise some system of deliberation, representation, decision, and implementation for those questions. And I always liked very much the work that Diane Elson did decades ago about the inadequacy of price signaling,
Mm.
right? As a kind of how you collect information. This is a problem in part of information, right?
Absolutely.
And the idea that what people buy is a sufficient stream or the only relevant, it might be relevant, but it's not the only relevant kind of information. And Elston's idea was to think about councils and deliberative bodies that look, think about, for example, we actually have real world experiments in participatory budgeting that's been used in
Very
cities
successful.
in Brazil and so on. There are other ways to think about this. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know what we do not want at that level. And that is, we do not want a stratum of nomenclatura, command economy decision makers, experts that are completely cut off. And on the one hand, and we don't want large investors on the other hand. So we have to invent the kinds of deliberative representative democratic bodies that, along with market information about purchasing, would.
Charles, my answer's a little bit shorter to that. Who would be the arbiter? It's Nancy. Nancy would be the arbiter. That's my answer. That's my answer to that. No. We've a couple of thoughts there on, I suppose, this markets, because we're speaking with an economist or a Marxist economist, you would imagine that markets would be something that would be completely thrown out. And one of my lecturers, John Harvey, says, being anti-market is like saying to a carpenter, are you anti-hammer or anti-nailing? He says, well, it depends. If I have to cut something, I'm very much pro-saw, right? But if I'm banging something in, I'm not really fussed about that. And I think it's really interesting to hear this, that there's a role for the market, maybe as identifying movements in price or helping allocate, but to throw it all out is something that seems a fairly uncommon view now from economists. And Charles agreed.
And I'm influenced by Polanyi on this, who really showed that the problem was the so-called self-regulating market, which is this weird invention of in the 19th century. But markets have existed, throughout history in all kinds of societies and are not per se problematic. I distinguish between the distributive function of markets, which is fine, who gets which apples and which shoes and so on and so forth, and the allocative function of markets. And that's the problem, the second one, which is about the overall channeling of resources.
Yeah, great. And I think Polanyi's stuff around markets, saying that markets are the idea that there's a market is not supported in any way by history. There was very different markets, regional markets, local markets, international markets. These were completely different things. Okay, I know we're running a bit short on time, but I've got a few more questions for you. Gregor is on at you again here. Thanks for this, Gregor. Is Cuba a good example of Marxism?
Oh, gosh. We're very close to Cuba here. Cuba was forced into the arms of the Soviet Union by my governments, my country. It was blockaded up to its eyeballs. It's a suffering place that has now essentially is in the process of joining the capitalist world economy for want of any alternative. There have been lots of good things about Cuba. Its medical humanitarianism internationally has been fantastic. Its record on gay and lesbian and queer rights has been dismal. It's obviously a mixed bag. Its record on race has been very good internally, I should say.
Okay, great. Another slightly obscure one for you here. We're throwing them all at you tonight. Could artificial intelligence help or hinder us explain cannibal capitalism's damage?
Probably both. I think that artificial intelligence, frankly, as I see it, the fear is not that the bots will take over, that the chat bots will take over. and outstrip us. The fear is that corporate capital will monetize everything. Will use this to sort of further dig us into this cannibal hole. In general, I think that a lot of technological advances could be used differently. But we could also decide, I've been reading a lot of William Morris lately, we could also decide to kind of do more craft handiwork and make our work more artful and pleasurable and maybe still feed and clothe and house everyone.
Yeah. Fantastic. I remember, Nancy, and apologies if I'm wrong, but I think I remember reading somewhere that you said, and I don't think it's in the book, but all socialists must be eco-socialists. Is that something that you said?
Equal socialists.
Eco-socialists.
Eco. Yes. Sorry.
Yes.
Well, I think that today, once you adopt the expanded view of capitalism as including the economy's background conditions and the relations between them and the economy, then you have to take an expanded view of socialism. Socialism is not just about changing this organization of the system of production. It's also about changing the relation between the system of production and reproduction and nature and family life and community life and political life and so on and so forth. So that means that I would say that socialists today should be eco-socialists, should be democratic socialists, should be feminist socialists, should be anti-racist socialists. I mean, all these things are built into that problem of an expanded view of socialism that is the true counterpart to an expanded critique of capitalism.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end the interview than that, Nancy. I've really, really enjoyed it. We've had some great engagement from the chat. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. I do, again, recommend everyone reads this. You'll probably get through it quicker than I did. It's a wonderful, I think it's a manifesto and certainly a book that I'm going to draw on, I think, for maybe the rest of my economic career. Nancy, thank you so much. And hopefully at some point I'll get to meet you somewhere. And
that would be lovely. I thank you, William. It's been a really enjoyable conversation, and I do appreciate the input from the chat. Excellent questions.
Thanks, Nancy. Bye for now.
Bye.
That was fantastic. I really hope you enjoyed that. What we're trying to do on Scotonomics is not just talk about the Scottish economy and the problems and the issues we have in pushing towards independence, but try to give a much broader overview of the issues that we think are really important as we start to try and frame a new economy, either within the constitutional settlement we have at the moment or a different one moving forward. If you did enjoy the show, and again, thanks very much for the comments and the feedback, please do like, share and comment. We've got another episode next week. It's a live episode and we're going to be talking about all the economic issues across January. So I do hope you can join us, and until next week, bye from me.